The story of the First World War begins not on a battlefield, but on a street corner in a city most people had never heard of, in a country that no longer exists, with a single gunshot that would echo across the entire 20th century. To understand how one bullet could lead to 20 million deaths, we must first understand the world that existed before that fateful summer day in 1914. A world that was both remarkably similar to our own and yet utterly different in ways that would make the coming catastrophe not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. Europe in the early 20th century was the undisputed center of global power. The great powers of the continent dominated the world through their empires, their industries, their armies, and their navies. Britain controlled an empire on which the sun never set, stretching from Canada to Australia, from India to Africa, encompassing roughly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. France held vast territories in Africa and Southeast Asia, while Germany, a relative newcomer to the imperial game, had carved out colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Russia sprawled across 2 continents, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known. Austria-Hungary, the dual monarchy, ruled over a patchwork of nationalities in Central Europe, while the Ottoman Empire, though declining, still controlled much of the Middle East and parts of the Balkans. These great powers existed in a state of competitive tension that had been building for decades. The unification of Germany in 1871 under the iron hand of Otto von Bismarck had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. Where once there had been a collection of small German states that could be played against each other by the larger powers, now there was a single powerful nation in the heart of the continent, industrializing at a tremendous rate, with the best educated population in Europe and the military tradition second to none. Germany's population was growing rapidly. Its factories were producing steel and chemicals and manufactured goods at rates that rivaled and sometimes surpassed Britain, and its army was the envy and fear of every other nation on the continent. Bismarck had understood that Germany's position in the center of Europe was both a strength and a vulnerability. Surrounded by potential enemies, Germany could be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Bismarck's solution was a complex web of alliances designed to keep France isolated and to maintain good relations with both Austria-Hungary and Russia, despite the tensions between those 2 empires. But Bismarck was dismissed by the young Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890, and German foreign policy took a more aggressive and less subtle turn. Kaiser Wilhelm was a complicated and deeply insecure man. The grandson of Queen Victoria of Britain, he had been born with a withered arm that was a source of lifelong shame and overcompensation. He admired the British and desperately wanted their respect, but he also resented their power and their seeming condescension toward Germany. He was impulsive, bombastic, and often said things in public that horrified his own diplomats. Most significantly, he abandoned Bismarck's careful balancing act and allowed the treaty with Russia to lapse, driving the Russians into an alliance with France, exactly the nightmare scenario Bismarck had worked so hard to prevent. The Franco-Russian alliance, formalized in the 1890s, meant that Germany now faced the prospect of a 2-front war, attacked simultaneously from east and west. This strategic situation would dominate German military planning for the next 2 decades and would ultimately shape the opening moves of the war itself. German planners, most notably Count Alfred von Schlieffen, developed elaborate strategies for dealing with this threat, strategies that would require lightning-fast mobilization and aggressive action from the very first day of any conflict. Britain, meanwhile, had traditionally stayed aloof from continental alliances, relying on its island position and dominant navy to protect it from European conflicts. But Germany's decision to build a great battle fleet, announced in the naval laws of 1898 and 1900, changed everything. For Britain, control of the seas was not merely a matter of pride, but of survival. An island nation dependent on imports for food and raw materials, Britain could be strangled into submission if an enemy gained control of the sea lanes. The Royal Navy was not just the first line of defense, but the only line that truly mattered. Germany's naval build-up was therefore seen not as a reasonable assertion of great power status, but as a direct existential threat. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany accelerated dramatically after 1906, when Britain launched the revolutionary battleship Dreadnought. This single ship rendered every other battleship in the world obsolete, including Britain's own massive fleet. The race now became a matter of who could build the most Dreadnought-type battleships fastest, and both nations poured enormous resources into the competition. The race generated tremendous popular excitement in both countries, with newspaper campaigns and public subscriptions for new ships. It also generated fear and suspicion that made the prospect of Anglo-German friendship increasingly remote. Britain moved closer to France through a series of agreements that, while not formal alliances, created expectations of mutual support. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 resolved long-standing colonial disputes between Britain and France, particularly in North Africa, and began a process of military and naval coordination that would prove crucial when war came. In 1907, Britain reached a similar understanding with Russia, resolving their rivalries in Central Asia and Persia. The result was the Triple Entente, an informal alignment of Britain, France, and Russia that stood against the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Europe was thus divided into two armed camps, each viewing the other with suspicion and fear. But this alone does not explain why war came. Europe had been divided before, and the great powers had managed their conflicts through diplomacy and limited wars. What made 1914 different was the accumulation of tensions, the rigidity of military plans, the failure of political leadership, and a series of crises that had hardened positions and raised the stakes to dangerous levels. The most volatile region in Europe was the Balkans, the mountainous peninsula in southeastern Europe where the Ottoman Empire had once held sway but was now in retreat. The vacuum left by Ottoman decline had been filled by newly independent nations: Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Romania, each with their own ambitions and grievances. These small states were backed by the great powers, with Russia supporting the Slavic nations, particularly Serbia, while Austria-Hungary sought to maintain its influence and prevent the emergence of a strong Slavic state on its southern border. Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, a move that infuriated Serbia, which had hoped to incorporate these Slavic territories into a greater Serbian state. The annexation had also humiliated Russia, which had been unable to support its Serbian ally due to military weakness following its defeat by Japan in 1905. Russia began a massive military buildup, determined never to be humiliated again. Serbia, meanwhile, became increasingly radical, with secret societies and nationalist organizations dreaming of a day when all South Slavs would be united under Serbian leadership. Two Balkan wars in 1912 and 1913 further destabilized the region, redrawing the map and leaving all parties dissatisfied. Serbia emerged from these wars doubled in size and more confident than ever, dreaming of further expansion at Austria-Hungary's expense. The Austro-Hungarian government, increasingly alarmed by Serbian nationalism and its potential to incite unrest among the empire's own Slavic populations, looked for an opportunity to crush Serbia once and for all. The generals in Vienna spoke openly of preventive war, arguing that it was better to fight Serbia now while Austria-Hungary still had the upper hand. This was the world into which Gavrilo Princip was born in 1994, in a small village in Bosnia that was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Princip was a Bosnian Serb, a member of the Slavic Orthodox minority in a province ruled by Catholic Austria-Hungary, He was small, sickly, and intense, a poor student with grand dreams and a deep sense of grievance. Like many young men of his generation, he was drawn to the romantic nationalism of the time, the belief that nations defined by language, culture, and blood had a right to self-determination and unity. Princip drifted to Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, where he fell in with a group of young revolutionaries who dreamed of freeing Bosnia from Austro-Hungarian rule and uniting it with Serbia. This group was connected to a shadowy organization known as the Black Hand, led by Colonel Dragutin Dmitrijević, a Serbian military intelligence officer who had been involved in the brutal murder of the Serbian king and queen in 1903. The Black Hand supported terrorist actions against Austria-Hungary and provided weapons and training to young zealots like Princip. In early 1914, the conspirators learned that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, would be visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, in late June. This seemed like a perfect opportunity. Franz Ferdinand was not universally hated. Indeed, he was known to favor reforms that would give the Slavic peoples of the empire more rights and autonomy, but this actually made him more dangerous in the eyes of Serbian nationalists. If he succeeded in reforming the empire and satisfying Slavic aspirations within its borders, the dream of South Slavic unity under Serbian leadership would be finished. He had to die. 6 young assassins, armed with pistols and bombs provided by the Black Hand, positioned themselves along the route that the Archduke's motorcade would take through Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. The date was significant. It was St. Vitus's Day. a holiday of tremendous importance to Serbian national identity, commemorating the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when the medieval Serbian kingdom had fallen to the Ottoman Turks. For Serbian nationalists, the choice of this date for the Archduke's visit was either a deliberate provocation or a sign of contemptuous ignorance, either way unforgivable. The morning of June 28 was bright and warm. The Archduke and his wife Sophie rode in an open car, waving to the crowds that lined the streets. The security arrangements were shockingly inadequate, with only a handful of local police and no military escort, despite the known threat of terrorism. The Archduke's advisers had warned him against the visit, but Franz Ferdinand was stubborn and perhaps fatalistic, and Sophie wanted to be by his side. The first assassination attempt came as the motorcade passed along the Apple Quay, the main street running beside the Miljacka River. One of the conspirators, Nedeusho Kabrinović, threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. The driver saw it coming and accelerated, and the bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible top and exploded under the following car, wounding several people, including an Austrian officer. Kabrinović swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into the river, but the pill was old and only made him sick, and the river was only a few inches deep. He was quickly captured by the crowd and beaten before police rescued him. The motorcade sped onto the town hall, where a visibly shaken and angry Archduke was greeted by the mayor with a prepared speech, welcoming him to Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand interrupted furiously, saying it was outrageous to be welcomed with bombs, but then he calmed himself and allowed the ceremonies to proceed. After the reception, there was a debate about what to do next. The Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded officer in the hospital. A decision was made to change the route to avoid the city centre, but crucially, no one informed the drivers. The motorcade set off again, and the lead car turned off the Appel Quay onto Franz Joseph Street, following the original route. When the error was realized, the driver of the Archduke's car was told to stop and reverse. By a coincidence so improbable that it seems almost like fate, the car stopped directly in front of Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen, where Gavrilo Princip had gone after the failed bomb attack, perhaps to get something to eat, perhaps merely despairing that the opportunity had been lost. Princip suddenly found himself standing just a few feet away from the Archduke and his wife, the targets he had crossed countries to kill, now miraculously delivered into his hands. He pulled out his pistol and fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second hit the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular vein. Sophie slumped against her husband, dead within moments. Franz Ferdinand remained conscious for a few more seconds, saying over and over, "It is nothing, it is nothing," before he too died. Princip tried to shoot himself but was wrestled to the ground by bystanders before he could pull the trigger. The assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was headline news around the world, but at first it did not seem that it would lead to war. Political assassinations were not uncommon in this era. The President of France had been assassinated in 1894, the Empress of Austria in 1898, the King of Italy in 1900, the President of the United States in 1901, the King and Queen of Serbia in 1903, in 1903. The world absorbed these shocks and moved on. Many expected the same would happen this time. But the Austro-Hungarian government saw the assassination as an opportunity as well as a tragedy. For years, the hawks in Vienna had been arguing for a war to crush Serbia and reassert Austrian dominance in the Balkans. Now they had their justification. The assassination was clearly linked to Serbian territory, even if the direct involvement of the Serbian government could not be proven. This was the moment to settle accounts once and for all. The key question was Germany. Austria-Hungary could not risk a war with Serbia if it meant facing Russia alone, for Russia had made clear that it would not tolerate the destruction of its Serbian ally. On July 5th, the Austrian ambassador met with Kaiser Wilhelm and received what became known as the blank check, Germany's unconditional promise to support Austria-Hungary, whatever it decided to do. The Kaiser assured the Austrians that they should act quickly while sympathy for them was still high, and that Germany would stand behind them even if this meant war with Russia. Why did Germany give this blank check? The Kaiser and his advisers seemed to have believed that a quick Austrian strike against Serbia could be localized, that Russia might be persuaded or forced to stand aside, and that even if Russia did intervene, Germany could win a continental war. There was also a sense of fatalism, a belief that war with Russia was coming sooner or later and that it was better to fight now, while Germany still had military advantages that were eroding as Russia continued its military build-up. The German military in particular had been arguing for years that the window of opportunity was closing, and that delay only favored Germany's enemies. Armed with German support, Austria-Hungary drafted a deliberately harsh ultimatum to Serbia, demanding, among other things, the suppression of all anti-Austrian propaganda, the dismissal of officials accused of involvement in the assassination, and the participation of Austrian officials in the investigation and prosecution of the conspirators on Serbian soil. This last demand was intended to be impossible for Serbia to accept, as it would have compromised Serbian sovereignty. The ultimatum was presented on July 23 and gave Serbia only 48 hours to respond. Serbia's response, delivered on July 25, was surprisingly conciliatory. The Serbian government accepted most of the Austrian demands and agreed to submit the rest to international arbitration or to the International Court at The Hague. Kaiser Wilhelm, when he read the Serbian response, thought it amounted to a capitulation and that all reason for war had disappeared. But it was too late. Austria-Hungary, determined on war, declared the Serbian response unsatisfactory and broke off diplomatic relations. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia could not stand by and watch its ally be destroyed. On July 29, Tsar Nicholas II ordered a partial mobilization of Russian forces against Austria-Hungary. This partial mobilization was intended as a warning and a demonstration of support for Serbia, not as a prelude to general war. But Russia's military planners had not prepared for a partial mobilization. Their plans were designed for a full mobilization against both Austria-Hungary and Germany simultaneously. A partial mobilization would throw the intricate timetables into chaos and leave Russia vulnerable if Germany did attack. The Russian generals pressed the Tsar for full mobilization, and on July 30th, he reluctantly agreed. This was the fatal decision, the point of no return. Russian full mobilization meant that millions of men would be called up, the trains would begin rolling toward the western borders, that the machinery of war would begin to move. And once it began to move, it could not easily be stopped. Germany now faced its nightmare scenario, a two-front war against Russia in the east and France in the west. The German war plans, which had been years in the making, required that Germany strike first and strike fast. The plan, developed by Schlieffen and modified by his successor Moltke, was to concentrate almost all German forces against France, knock France out of the war in 6 weeks, and then turn east to face Russia before the slow Russian mobilization was complete. The plan had a fatal flaw. It required Germany to attack through neutral Belgium, which would almost certainly bring Britain into the war. But the German generals had convinced themselves that the plan was the only option and that speed was everything. On July 31st, Germany sent ultimatums to both Russia and France. Russia was given 12 hours to halt its mobilization. France was given 18 hours to declare its neutrality in the event of a Russo-German war, and as a guarantee of neutrality, was required to hand over the fortresses of Toul and Verdun to German occupation. These demands were impossible, designed to be rejected, providing Germany with justification for war. Russia did not respond to the ultimatum. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. France refused to promise neutrality and began its own mobilization. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. That same day, German troops crossed the border into Luxembourg and demanded passage through Belgium. Belgium refused. On August 4th, German forces invaded Belgium, and Britain, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in a treaty dating back to 1839, declared war on Germany. In the space of a week, a local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had become a general European war. The alliance systems designed to prevent war by making the consequences of aggression unbearable had instead ensured that war, once begun, would spread until it engulfed the entire continent. The mobilization plans designed to ensure rapid victory had instead created a situation in which every nation felt compelled to mobilize as quickly as possible, turning a diplomatic crisis into a military emergency. And the political leaders, who might have found a peaceful solution if given more time, were swept along by the inexorable logic of war, unable to stop the avalanche they had set in motion. The war that began in August 1914 was greeted with enthusiasm in all the major capitals. Crowds cheered in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and London. Young men rushed to enlist, afraid that the war would be over before they had a chance to fight. The general expectation was that the war would be short, decided by a few great battles, and over by Christmas. This was not unreasonable given the recent precedents. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 had been decided in a matter of months. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05 had lasted only a year and a half. No one anticipated the 4 years of slaughter that lay ahead. The German war plan called for a massive wheeling movement through Belgium and northern France, swinging around Paris from the west and trapping the French armies against their own fortifications in a gigantic encirclement. The plan required precise timing and overwhelming force at the point of attack. 7 German armies, comprising more than 1.5 million men, began their advance in early August, crashing through the small Belgian army and pushing toward France. Belgium resisted more fiercely than the Germans had anticipated. The fortresses around Liège held out for nearly 2 weeks, disrupting the German timetable and giving the Allies precious time to prepare. The Germans responded with massive siege guns, including the enormous 420mm howitzers known as Big Berthas, which reduced the Belgian forts to rubble. But the delay mattered. The German advance was accompanied by atrocities against Belgian civilians. German soldiers, nervous and suspicious, saw saboteurs and snipers everywhere. Franc-tireurs, civilian guerrilla fighters, had been a feature of the Franco-Prussian War, and German commanders were determined to suppress any resistance ruthlessly. Towns were burned, civilians were shot, including women and children. The most notorious incident occurred at Louvain, where German troops destroyed the medieval library of the university and killed over 200 civilians. These atrocities, sometimes exaggerated but often all too real, were publicized around the world and did enormous damage to Germany's international reputation, particularly in neutral America. Britain's small professional army, the British Expeditionary Force, began crossing to France on August 9th. It numbered only about 100,000 men, tiny compared to the continental conscript armies, but it was highly trained and equipped with excellent rifles. The BF took up positions on the left flank of the French line, near the Belgian border, and waited for the German onslaught. The French, meanwhile, were executing their own war plan, known as Plan 17. This plan called for a massive offensive into the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which France had been forced to cede to Germany after the War of 1870–71. The French commanders, imbued with the doctrine of the offensive at all costs, believed that élan, fighting spirit, would overcome any obstacle. French soldiers went into battle wearing bright red trousers and blue coats, carrying their rifles at the charge, their officers leading from the front with drawn swords. The result was catastrophe. The French attacks ran straight into prepared German defenses, machine guns and artillery that mowed down the advancing infantry in windows. The battles of the frontiers, fought in August 1914, cost France over 300,000 casualties in less than a month, including over 75,000 dead. An entire generation of young officers, the future leaders of the French army, was slaughtered in those first terrible weeks. The French offensive collapsed, and the Germans continued their advance. The British Expeditionary Force met the Germans at Mons in Belgium on August 23rd. The British soldiers, with their accurate rapid rifle fire, inflicted heavy casualties on the advancing Germans, who thought they were facing machine guns. But the British were outnumbered and outflanked, and after a day of fighting they were forced to retreat. The retreat from Mons began a terrible march southward, as the exhausted British soldiers trudged through the summer heat, fighting rearguard actions against the pursuing Germans. The Allied situation seemed desperate. The French armies were reeling back in defeat. The British were retreating. Paris itself seemed likely to fall. The French government prepared to flee to Bordeaux. General Joseph Joffre, the commander of the French armies, remained calm, dismissing incompetent generals and frantically shifting forces to meet the German threat. He realized the Germans had made a crucial error. Instead of sweeping west of Paris as the original Schlieffen plan had intended, the German First Army under General von Kluck had turned southeast, passing east of Paris and exposing its flank to attack. Joffre saw his opportunity. He ordered a general counterattack along the Marne River, beginning on September the 5th. The French Sixth Army struck the exposed flank of the German First Army, while the rest of the Allied line held firm. The Battle of the Marne, fought over 6 days in early September, was one of the decisive battles of the war. The Germans, exhausted by their long march and overstretched by their advance, were forced to retreat to the Aisne River. Paris was saved. The war would not be over by Christmas. The Battle of the Marne has sometimes been called the Miracle of the Marne, and it did seem miraculous that the German advance, which had seemed so unstoppable, was suddenly halted and reversed. But there was no miracle, only the exhaustion of the German troops, the brilliance of French generalship, and the courage of the Allied soldiers who stood and fought when all seemed lost. Among the more colourful episodes of the battle was the use of Parisian taxicabs to rush reinforcements to the front. a symbol of the total mobilization of French society in defense of the nation. After the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other to the north, in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. Neither side succeeded in turning the other's flank, and by October, the front extended from the Swiss border to the English Channel, a continuous line of trenches and fortifications, some 400 miles long. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, events had moved just as dramatically, but with very different results. Russia had mobilized faster than anyone expected, and 2 Russian armies invaded East Prussia in mid-August. The German Eighth Army, heavily outnumbered, seemed likely to be overwhelmed, but the German commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, made brilliant use of their interior lines and their superior railway network to concentrate against each Russian army in turn. At the Battle of Tannenberg, fought from August 26 to 30th, the Germans surrounded and destroyed the Russian Second Army under General Samsonov. Nearly 90,000 Russian soldiers were captured, and Samsonov, in despair, shot himself. A week later, at the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, the Germans drove the Russian First Army out of East Prussia with heavy losses. These twin victories made Hindenburg and Ludendorff national heroes and established their reputations as military geniuses. They also ended any threat of Russian invasion of German territory, although the war in the East would continue for 3 more years. Further south, the Austro-Hungarian armies had not fared so well. Their invasion of Serbia was repulsed with heavy losses, and the Serbian army, fighting on its own ground with desperate courage, drove the Austrians back across the border. By the end of 1914, Serbia remained unconquered, a humiliating failure for the empire that had started the war to destroy it. Meanwhile, the Russian armies had invaded Galicia, the Austrian province that is now part of Ukraine, and had inflicted a series of crushing defeats on the Austro-Hungarian forces. The great fortress of Przemysl was besieged and would eventually fall in March 1915. Austria-Hungary's army never really recovered from the losses of 1914, and for the rest of the war it would need German support to maintain its position. As the year 1914 came to an end, the shape of the war was becoming clear. It would not be the short, decisive conflict that everyone had expected. Instead, it would be a war of attrition, a test of endurance, in which the side with the most men, the most resources, and the most willpower would eventually prevail. The Western Front had become a continuous line of trenches, defended by machine guns and artillery, where any attack would be met with devastating firepower. The technology of defense, barbed wire and concrete and high-explosive shells, had become so powerful that attack seemed almost impossible, and yet the generals on both sides believed that attack was the only way to win, and they would spend the next 3 years sacrificing millions of lives in the attempt to break through. The trenches of the Western Front would become the defining image of the First World War, the symbol of its futility and horror. The trench system was not a single line, but a complex network of front-line trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, and communication trenches, connected by a web of tunnels and dugouts. The front-line trenches faced each other across a stretch of torn and cratered ground known as no man's land, which might be as narrow as 50 yards or as wide as half a mile. This ground was defended by multiple belts of barbed wire, sometimes 20 or 30 feet deep, and covered by machine guns that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Life in the trenches was a nightmare of mud, rats, lice, and constant danger. The trenches flooded in the rain, and soldiers stood for hours and days in water up to their knees or waists, developing a painful condition known as trench foot that could lead to gangrene and amputation. The rats, feeding on the bodies of the dead, grew to enormous size and were everywhere, running over the soldiers as they tried to sleep, stealing their food, spreading disease. The lice infested every garment and every body, causing constant itching and transmitting trench fever, a debilitating illness that could knock a man out for weeks. The constant shelling took a terrible toll, not just in physical casualties, but in psychological damage. Men lived with the knowledge that at any moment a shell might land in their trench and obliterate them without warning. The noise was indescribable, a constant thunder that could last for hours or days. Men went deaf, went mad, developed what was then called shell shock and is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They trembled uncontrollably, lost the power of speech, relived the horror of bombardment over and over again. Many never recovered. And yet there were also moments of unexpected humanity. The most famous of these was the Christmas Truce of 1914, when soldiers on both sides spontaneously laid down their weapons, climbed out of their trenches, and met in no man's land to exchange gifts, sing carols, and even play football. This remarkable episode, which occurred along various parts of the line, was not repeated in subsequent years. The generals, horrified by this fraternization with the enemy, took steps to ensure that it would not happen again. The war had to be fought with hatred, not humanity. The year 1915 saw both sides searching for a way to break the deadlock. The Allies attacked repeatedly on the Western Front, at Neuve-Chapelle in March, at Neuve-Chapelle in Arch, at Ypres in April and May, at Ottawa in May and June, at Loos in September and October. All these offensives failed, gaining at most a few miles of ground at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. The Germans discovered that it was far easier to hold ground than to take it, that a well-prepared defensive position could absorb enormous punishment and still repel attack after attack. The Second Battle of Ypres in April and May 1915 saw the first use of poison gas on the Western Front. On April 22nd, the Germans released chlorine gas from cylinders along a 4-mile section of the front, sending a greenish-yellow cloud drifting toward the French and Algerian troops holding that part of the line. The gas caused panic and thousands of casualties as soldiers choked and died, their lungs destroyed by the corrosive chemical. A gap several miles wide opened in the Allied line. But the Germans had not anticipated the success of their new weapon and lacked the reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The Allies rushed in reinforcements and held the line. Gas became a regular feature of the war after Ypres, used by both sides in ever more deadly forms. Chlorine was followed by phosgene, which was more lethal and harder to detect. In 1917, the Germans introduced mustard gas, which caused severe blistering of the skin and could persist in the soil and vegetation for days, making areas impassable. Gas masks became standard equipment, but they were uncomfortable and reduced the effectiveness of soldiers who wore them. Gas never proved to be a war-winning weapon, but it added a new dimension of horror to the conflict. While the Allies attacked in the West, they also searched for alternative strategies, ways to outflank the German position and strike at weaker enemies. The most ambitious of these was the Gallipoli campaign, an attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia through the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in November 1914, partly because of the influence of pro-German officers in the Ottoman army, and partly because the Young Turk government saw an opportunity to recover territories lost in the Balkan Wars and to strike at their traditional enemy, Russia. The Ottomans launched an offensive into the Russian Caucasus in December 1914, which ended in disaster at the Battle of Sarikamish, with tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers dying of cold and disease in the mountain passes. The Ottoman government blamed the Armenian population of the region for supporting the Russians, and this would be the pretext for the Armenian genocide that began in the spring of 1915. The Gallipoli campaign began with a naval assault in February and March 1915, as British and French warships attempted to force their way through the Dardanelles and reach Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. The attempt failed disastrously, with 3 battleships sunk by mines and several others badly damaged. The fleet withdrew, and it was decided that ground forces would be needed to clear the peninsula of its defenders before the ships could pass. The landings at Gallipoli began on April 25, 1915, a date that is still commemorated in Australia and New Zealand as Anzac Day. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or AMZAC, made up a large portion of the landing force, along with British, French, and Indian troops. The landings were met with fierce Turkish resistance, and the Allied forces were unable to advance far from their beachheads. The Turks, commanded by the German General Lehmann von Sanders and led on the ground by a young Turkish officer named Mustafa Kemal, the future founder of modern Turkey, fought with tremendous courage and determination. The campaign became another exercise in trench warfare, with all the horror and futility of the Western Front, but in even worse conditions. The summer heat was unbearable, water was scarce, dysentery and other diseases were rampant, and the dead could not be properly buried, their bodies rotting in no man's land and attracting swarms of flies. The casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands on both sides. By the end of the year, it was clear that the campaign had failed. The Allied forces were evacuated in December 1915 and January 1916, the evacuation being the most successful part of the entire operation. conducted with minimal casualties through clever deception. Gallipoli was a disaster for the Allies, but it was also a forge of national identity for Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey. For the young dominions of the British Empire, the courage and sacrifice of their soldiers at Gallipoli marked their emergence as distinct nations on the world stage. For Turkey, the defense of Gallipoli was proof that the Turkish people could resist European imperialism and determine their own destiny. Mustafa Kemal emerged as a national hero, the savior of the nation, and his reputation would carry him to power in the years after the war. 1915 also saw Italy enter the war on the side of the Allies. Italy had been formally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but had declared neutrality in August 1914, arguing that the alliance was defensive and that Austria-Hungary had been the aggressor. Both sides then began bidding for Italian support, offering territorial concessions in exchange for military intervention. The Allies offered more, promising Italy not only the Italian-speaking territories of Austria-Hungary, but also control of the Adriatic coast and parts of Turkey. Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary in May 1915, and soon afterward on Germany as well. The Italian front ran along the mountainous border between Italy and Austria-Hungary, including the Alps and the rocky plateau of the Carso. The terrain was some of the most difficult in Europe, with fighting taking place at elevations of 10,000 feet and more, in snow and ice and bitter cold. The Italian commander, General Luigi Cadorna, was a brutal disciplinarian who believed in attacking relentlessly regardless of casualties. Over the next 2.5 years, he would launch 11 offensives along the Isonzo River, none of which achieved any significant breakthrough, all of which resulted in enormous losses. On the Eastern Front, 1915 was the year of German triumph. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians launched a massive offensive in May, breaking through the Russian lines at Gorlistano and advancing hundreds of miles into Russian territory. By the end of the year, the Russians had lost Poland, Lithuania, and most of Latvia, along with over 2 million casualties, half of them prisoners. The Russian army was running short of everything: rifles, ammunition, artillery shells. Soldiers were sometimes sent into battle unarmed, told to pick up weapons from the dead. The demoralization and suffering of the Russian army would have profound consequences in the years to come. The Central Powers also finally succeeded in defeating Serbia in 1915. Bulgaria, which had grievances against Serbia from the Second Balkan War, joined the war on the German side in October, and the combined Austro-Hungarian, German, and Bulgarian forces overwhelmed the small Serbian army. The Serbs retreated across the mountains of Albania in terrible conditions, with thousands dying of cold, hunger, and disease. The survivors were eventually evacuated to Corfu by Allied ships and reconstituted to fight again, but Serbia itself was occupied, and would remain so until the end of the war. As 1915 ended, the war seemed to be going badly for the Allies. The Western Front was deadlocked with no prospect of breakthrough. The Eastern Front had seen massive German victories. Gallipoli had failed. Serbia had fallen. Italy's entry had produced nothing but more casualties. The only bright spots were the successful defense of the Suez Canal against a Turkish attack and the beginning of the campaign in Mesopotamia, where British and Indian forces were advancing toward Baghdad. But even this success would turn to disaster in the new year. 1916 would be the year of the great battles: Verdun and the Somme on the Western Front, Brusilov on the Eastern Front, Jutland at sea. It would be a year of unprecedented slaughter, in which hundreds of thousands of men would die for gains measured in yards. It would also be the year in which the nature of the war began to change, as new weapons appeared, as the home fronts mobilized for total war, and as the strain began to tell on all the combatants. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, when the Germans launched a massive assault on the French fortress city on the Meuse River. Verdun had no great strategic importance, but it had enormous symbolic value. It had been a stronghold since Roman times and had never fallen to an invader. The German commander, General Erich von Falkenhayn, believed that France would defend Verdun to the last man, and that by threatening the city he could bleed the French army white in a war of attrition. The German bombardment was the heaviest the world had ever seen, with over 1 million shells fired on the first day alone. The French lines were smashed, and German troops advanced into the ruined landscape, capturing the strategic Fort Douaumont within a few days. The French commander, General Philippe Pétain, organized the defense with grim determination, rotating units through the inferno of Verdun so that the burden was shared across the entire army. The road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, the only supply route, became known as the Sacred Way, as an endless stream of trucks carried men and supplies to the front. The fighting at Verdun continued for 10 months until December 1916. Both sides attacked and counterattacked, fighting for hills and forts and positions that changed hands multiple times. The French rallying cry became, "They shall not pass," and they did not, but the cost was horrific. The total casualties, killed, wounded and missing, were approximately 700,000, divided roughly equally between the two sides. The Germans failed to break the French army, but they came close. France emerged from Verdun, exhausted and traumatized, with its offensive capacity permanently diminished. The Battle of the Somme was originally planned as a joint Anglo-French offensive to break through the German lines and end the war in the west. But Verdun changed everything. As French resources were drawn into the battle there, the burden of the Somme fell increasingly on the British, whose new volunteer armies were now arriving in France in large numbers. These were the men who had responded to Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers in 1914, the famous pointing poster with "Your country needs you." They had spent nearly 2 years training and were eager to prove themselves in battle. The preliminary bombardment for the Somme lasted 7 days, with over 1.5 million shells fired at the German positions. The British commanders believed that this bombardment would destroy the German trenches and cut the barbed wire, allowing the infantry to walk across no man's land and occupy the enemy positions. They were tragically wrong. The Germans had built deep dugouts, some of them 30 feet below ground, which protected their troops from even the heaviest shells. The wire was not cut, but merely churned up and rearranged, creating an even greater obstacle. And many of the British shells were defective, failing to explode. On the morning of July 1, 1916, the bombardment lifted, and the British infantry went over the top. They advanced in long lines, walking slowly because they were carrying heavy packs and because their officers had told them the Germans would all be dead. The Germans were not dead. The Germans were not dead. They emerged from their dugouts, set up their machine guns, and opened fire. The British soldiers walked into a storm of lead, falling in windows, cut down before they could reach the German wire. By the end of the first day, the British army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including over 19,000 dead. It was the worst day in the history of the British Army, before or since, and yet the battle continued. The British and French attacked again and again throughout the summer and autumn, gradually pushing the Germans back a few miles at enormous cost. In September, the British introduced a new weapon, the tank, an armoured vehicle designed to cross no man's land, crush barbed wire, and overwhelm enemy trenches. The first tanks were slow, unreliable, and few in number, and their impact was more psychological than tactical. But they pointed the way to the future, to a form of warfare that would break the deadlock of the trenches. The Battle of the Somme ended in November 1916, with the onset of winter making further operations impossible. The total casualties were over 1 million, perhaps 600,000 on the German side and 400,000 on the Allied side, though the exact figures are disputed. The Allies had advanced about 6 miles along a front of some 15 miles. By any rational measure, the battle was a defeat, or at best a draw, but the British commanders proclaimed it a success, arguing that the German army had been worn down and that victory was now only a matter of time and attrition. On the Eastern Front, the summer of 1916 saw the most successful Allied offensive of the entire war. General Alexei Brusilov, commanding the Russian armies in the southwest, devised a new method of attack that emphasized surprise, careful preparation, and simultaneous assaults along a wide front. The Brusilov offensive, launched on June 4th, broke through the Austro-Hungarian lines and advanced up to 60 miles in some sectors. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered catastrophic losses, over 1 million casualties, including hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It never recovered and would need German support for every subsequent operation. The Brusilov offensive also had far-reaching political consequences. It encouraged Romania to enter the war on the Allied side in August, hoping to gain Transylvania and other territories from Austria-Hungary and other territories from Austria-Hungary. But the Romanian army was poorly equipped and led, and within a few months the Central Powers had overrun most of the country, gaining access to Romania's oil fields and grain supplies. The Russian advance also stalled as supply lines stretched and German reinforcements arrived. By the end of the year, the Eastern Front had stabilized again, with Russia having gained significant territory but having suffered enormous losses that would contribute to the revolution the following year. At sea, 1916 saw the only major fleet battle of the war, the Battle of Jutland, fought on May 31st and June 1st in the North Sea. The British Grand Fleet, the largest and most powerful naval force in the world, confronted the German High Seas Fleet in an engagement that both sides had anticipated and feared for years. The battle was confused and inconclusive, fought in poor visibility with both sides making errors of communication and tactics. The British lost more ships and more men, 3 battle cruisers and over 6,000 killed, compared to 1 German battle cruiser and about 2,500 killed. But strategically, the battle was a British victory, for the German fleet never again seriously challenged British control of the sea. The German naval strategy shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare, with consequences that would prove decisive. The submarine had begun the war as an experimental weapon of uncertain value. By 1916, it had become the greatest threat to British survival. German U-boats prowled the sea lanes around Britain, sinking merchant ships carrying food, raw materials, and munitions. The British depended on imports for their very existence, and the German admirals believed that if they could sink enough shipping, they could starve Britain into surrender within a few months. The problem was neutral shipping, particularly American ships. The United States was neutral in the war but was trading extensively with Britain and France, sending food, cotton, steel, and weapons across the Atlantic. German submarines could not tell the difference between British and American ships, and American passengers and crew were dying in U-boat attacks. The most notorious incident had occurred in May 1915, when the British liner Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The sinking caused outrage in the United States and brought the country close to war. After the Lusitania, Germany had restricted its submarine campaign to avoid antagonizing America. But by early 1917, the German High Command concluded that they had no choice. The war on land was a stalemate. The British blockade was slowly strangling Germany, and the only hope was to cut Britain's sea lanes before American intervention could make a difference. On February 1, 1917, Germany announced that it would sink without warning any ship, belligerent or neutral, found in the waters around Britain and France. This was a gamble, but the German admirals were confident that they could force Britain to its knees before America could mobilize. The unrestricted submarine campaign was initially devastatingly effective. In April 1917 alone, U-boats sank nearly 900,000 tons of shipping, far more than could be replaced. Britain had only a few weeks of food reserves, and the situation seemed desperate. But the British fought back with new tactics, most importantly the convoy system, in which merchant ships travelled in groups protected by warships. The convoy system dramatically reduced losses, and combined with new technologies like depth charges and hydrophones, it turned the tide against the U-boats. By the end of 1917, the submarine threat had been contained, though not eliminated. The German decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare had another consequence that the German admirals had failed to anticipate. It brought the United States into the war. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election in November 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and he had genuinely hoped to mediate a peace settlement between the warring powers. But the sinking of American ships and the deaths of American citizens made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. The final straw came with the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a secret message to the German ambassador in Mexico proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. In exchange for Mexican support, Germany would help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, territories lost in the Mexican-American War 70 years before. British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram and passed it to the American government, which released it to the press. The publication of the Zimmermann telegram caused a sensation and turned American public opinion decisively against Germany. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, saying that the world must be made safe for democracy. Congress approved the declaration on April 6th. The United States was now in the war, with its enormous industrial capacity, its vast population, and its limitless resources. The question was whether American power could be brought to bear before Germany won the war in Europe. The American army in April 1917 was tiny, barely 200,000 men, including the National Guard. It would take more than a year to recruit, train, and transport an army large enough to make a difference on the Western Front. Meanwhile, events in Russia would transform the strategic situation in ways that no one could have predicted. The Russian Revolution began in March 1917, when strikes and protests in Petrograd, the Russian capital, escalated into open revolt. The soldiers of the garrison, instead of suppressing the demonstrations, joined them. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and out of touch, abdicated on March 15th, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government took power, pledging to continue the war while also introducing democratic reforms. But the provisional government faced challenges from the left, particularly from the Soviets, or workers' councils, that had sprung up in the major cities. The most radical of the socialist parties, the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin, demanded an immediate end to the war and the transfer of all power to the Soviets. Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland when the revolution began, but the German government, seeing an opportunity to knock Russia out of the war, arranged his passage home in a sealed train. He arrived in Petrograd in April and immediately began agitating against the provisional government. The provisional government, caught between the pressures of war and revolution, tried to satisfy both and ended up satisfying neither. In July, it launched a major offensive against the Austro-Hungarian and German forces, hoping that military success would unite the country. A Kerensky offensive, named after the war minister Alexander Kerensky, began promisingly but quickly collapsed as Russian soldiers, demoralized and exhausted, refused to fight. The Germans counterattacked, and the Russian army disintegrated, with entire units melting away as soldiers deserted and went home. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd and declared the establishment of a workers' state. Lenin immediately sought an armistice with Germany, fulfilling his promise to end the war. The negotiations dragged on for months as the Germans demanded enormous territorial concessions. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, was a diktat, a dictated peace in which Russia gave up Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Finland, losing over 1/3 of its population and agricultural land and most of its industry. Lenin accepted these terms because he had no choice, believing that the revolution in Russia would soon spread to Germany and the rest of Europe, making the treaty irrelevant. The collapse of Russia was a disaster for the Allies, but it gave them a momentary advantage. Germany could now transfer troops from the Eastern Front to the West, but this would take time. Meanwhile, American troops were beginning to arrive in France, slowly at first but in ever-increasing numbers. The question was whether Germany could win the war in the West before American strength became overwhelming. Back on the Western Front, 1917 had been another year of costly failure for the Allies. The French launched a major offensive in April, along the Chemin des Dames Ridge, which had been promised as the breakthrough that would end the war. Instead, it was another bloodbath, with tens of thousands of casualties for minimal gains. The failure of the Nivelle offensive, named after General Robert Nivelle, who had promised so much, broke something in the French army. Beginning in late April, French soldiers began to refuse orders, to demonstrate, even to desert. This was the French army mutinies, a crisis that threatened to take France out of the war entirely. The mutinies were not a refusal to fight, but a refusal to attack. The soldiers would hold their positions. They would defend France, but they would not participate in more futile offensives that sacrificed their lives for nothing. General Pétain, the hero of Verdun, was brought in to restore order. He combined firm discipline with over 500 death sentences, though only about 50 were actually carried out, with reforms that addressed the soldiers' legitimate grievances. Leave was improved, food was made better, and most importantly, the suicidal attacks stopped. The French army recovered, but it would never be the same. For the rest of the war, the burden of offensive operations would fall primarily on the British. The British continued attacking through 1917, with the Battle of Arras in April and the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele, from July to November. Passchendaele became a byword for the horror and futility of the war. The battlefield was transformed by rain and shelling into a sea of mud, in which men and horses drowned. The British advanced about 5 miles over 4 months, at a cost of over 250,000 casualties. The village of Passchendaele itself was captured in early November, but the position was so exposed and so costly to hold that it was abandoned within a few months. The British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, remained convinced that he was wearing down the German army and that victory was near. His generals told him what he wanted to hear, and the killing continued. The one bright spot for the British in 1917 was the Battle of Cambrai in November, which saw the first large-scale use of tanks. Nearly 400 tanks attacked without a preliminary bombardment, achieving complete surprise and breaking through the German lines to a depth of 5 miles in a single day. Church bells rang in Britain, the first time they had rung for a victory since the war began. But the British lacked the reserves to exploit the breakthrough, and the Germans counterattacked, retaking most of the ground. Cambrai showed what was possible with new tactics and new weapons, but also how difficult it was to translate local success into strategic victory. On the Italian front, 1917 wrought disaster. In October, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians launched a massive offensive at Caporetto, using new infiltration tactics that bypassed strongpoints and struck deep into the enemy rear. The Italian army collapsed, retreating over 70 miles and losing nearly 300,000 prisoners. Only the arrival of British and French reinforcements stabilized the front on the Piave River. General Cadorna was dismissed in disgrace, replaced by Armando Diaz, who began the slow work of rebuilding the shattered Italian army. As 1917 ended, the war hung in the balance. Russia was out, Italy was crippled, France was exhausted, and Britain was running out of men. Germany was transferring troops from the east and preparing for a final offensive in the spring that would decide the war. The Americans were coming, but they were not yet present in significant numbers. The next few months would be the most critical of the entire war. The German spring offensive of 1918 began on March 21st with an attack on the British lines in Picardy. The Germans had developed new tactics, combining a short but intense artillery bombardment with infiltration by specially trained storm troops who bypassed strongpoints and penetrated deep into the enemy rear. The attack achieved complete surprise and broke through the British lines, advancing up to 40 miles in some sectors. It was the greatest advance on the Western Front since 1914. The British Fifth Army was shattered, losing over 100,000 prisoners in the first few days. The Germans seemed poised to split the British and French armies and drive to the sea. In desperation, the Allies appointed a supreme commander, the French General Ferdinand Foch, to coordinate the defense. Foch rushed reserves to the threatened sector, and the German advance gradually slowed as supply lines stretched and exhausted troops outran their artillery support. The Germans launched 4 more major offensives between March and July 1918, each achieving initial success but failing to deliver a decisive victory. The attacks on the Lys Robimanus in April, on the Chemin des Dames in May, on the Marne in June, and again on the Marne in July, all followed the same pattern. Initial breakthrough, rapid advance, growing exhaustion, counterattack, and stabilization. The Germans were winning battles but losing the war, for each offensive cost them irreplaceable casualties, while the Allies could draw on American reinforcements that were now arriving at a rate of 250,000 men per month. The turning point came on July 18th, when the Allies launched a counteroffensive at the Second Battle of the Marne, using tanks and aircraft in a coordinated assault that drove the Germans back with heavy losses. This was the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive, a series of Allied attacks that would continue without pause until the armistice in November. The German army, exhausted and demoralized by the failure of its spring offensives, began to crack. August 8, 1918, was what the German General Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army. At the Battle of Amiens, British, French, Australian and Canadian forces attacked with over 400 tanks, achieving complete surprise and advancing 8 miles in a single day. German units surrendered in large numbers, something that had been almost unheard of earlier in the war. The German army was not yet defeated, and it would continue to fight stubbornly for 3 more months. But it was clear that Germany could not win. The question was now how long the war would continue and how it would end. The German High Command, recognizing that the military situation was hopeless, sought an armistice. They turned to the political leadership, telling them for the first time how desperate the situation was, and demanded that the politicians negotiate an end to the war. The Kaiser appointed a new chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, a moderate who was considered acceptable to the Allies. Prince Max sent a note to President Wilson on October 3rd, asking for an armistice based on Wilson's 14 points, a statement of war aims that Wilson had announced in January 1918. Wilson's 14 points called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, and the right of self-determination for all peoples. They also called for the creation of a League of Nations that would prevent future wars by providing a forum for resolving international disputes peacefully. The 14 points were idealistic, even utopian, but they offered Germany the hope of a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. The German government accepted them as the basis for negotiations, hoping to end the war with Germany's borders and government intact. But while the diplomats negotiated, events were moving faster than anyone could control. Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29th, opening the Balkans to Allied advance. The Ottoman Empire, defeated in Palestine and Mesopotamia, signed an armistice on October 30th. Austria-Hungary, disintegrating as its component nationalities declared independence, signed an armistice on November 3rd. Germany was alone. Within Germany, the situation was becoming revolutionary. The naval command ordered the fleet to sea for a final battle against the British, a futile gesture of honor that the sailors refused to obey. Mutiny broke out in Kiel on October 29th and spread rapidly to other ports and cities. Workers went on strike, soldiers' councils were formed, and red flags appeared over town halls across Germany. The Kaiser, increasingly isolated and irrelevant, refused to abdicate despite the urging of his own advisers. On November 9th, Prince Max announced the Kaiser's abdication without his consent and handed power to the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert. The Kaiser fled to Holland, where he would spend the rest of his life in exile. A republic was proclaimed in Berlin, but it was contested from the start by radical socialists who wanted a revolution on the Russian model. Germany teetered on the edge of civil war. The armistice was signed at 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France. The German delegation, led by a civilian politician named Matthias Erzberger, had no choice but to accept the harsh terms dictated by Foch. Germany would evacuate all occupied territory in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Alsace-Lorraine. It would surrender its heavy weapons, its fleet, its submarines, its aircraft, and its railway locomotives. Allied troops would occupy the Rhineland. The naval blockade would continue until a final peace treaty was signed. The terms were not a negotiation, but a capitulation. The armistice took effect at 11 o'clock in the morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Along the Western Front, the guns fell silent after more than 4 years of continuous warfare. Soldiers who had been shooting at each other an hour before climbed out of their trenches and met in no man's land, shaking hands and exchanging cigarettes, unable quite to believe that it was over. In the cities of the Allied nations, crowds celebrated with wild joy, dancing in the streets and cheering the end of the nightmare. In Germany, there was no celebration, only the bitter realization of defeat and the fear of what was to come. The First World War was over, but its consequences would shape the rest of the 20th century. The human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Approximately 10 million soldiers had been killed, with another 20 million wounded, many of them permanently disabled. Civilian deaths from war-related causes, including famine, disease, and genocide, added perhaps another 10 million. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919, spread by the movements of troops and refugees, killed an estimated 50 million people, more than the war itself. An entire generation of young men had been decimated, leaving behind millions of widows, orphans, and grieving parents. The map of Europe was redrawn by the peace treaties that followed the war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany, including the loss of territory, strict limits on its military, and enormous reparations payments. The War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept responsibility for starting the war, was particularly resented and would be exploited by nationalist politicians in the years to come. Germany emerged from the war defeated, humiliated, and bitter, fertile ground for the extremism that would lead to the Second World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist, broken up into the successor states of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, with parts of its territory going to Poland, Romania, and Italy. The Ottoman Empire was similarly dismembered, with its Arab provinces divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates. Turkey itself was nearly partitioned, but was saved by a war of independence led by Mustafa Kemal, who established a secular republic on the ruins of the old empire. The Russian Empire had already been transformed by the Bolshevik Revolution into the Soviet Union, which would become a global power and ideological rival to the West for most of the 20th century. The civil war that followed the revolution killed millions and established a pattern of violence and repression that would characterize the Soviet state. Lenin's hope that the revolution would spread to the rest of Europe was disappointed, at least in the short term, but communism became a powerful force in world politics, inspiring both hope and fear. The United States emerged from the war as the world's greatest economic and potentially military power, but it retreated into isolationism, rejecting membership in the League of Nations that Wilson had championed. The League was created, but without the participation of the United States, Russia, or initially Germany, it lacked the power to enforce its decisions. It would prove unable to prevent the aggression of the 1930s that led to the Second World War. The war transformed societies as well as maps. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war, replacing men who had gone to fight, and this experience contributed to the winning of women's suffrage in many countries, including Britain and the United States. The old aristocratic order was shattered, and new social and political forces emerged. Veterans returned from the war traumatized and disillusioned, unable to resume the lives they had left behind, and resentful of a society that they felt had betrayed them. The lost generation, the young men who survived the war but were forever marked by it, became a powerful theme in literature and culture. The experience of total war, in which entire societies mobilized for conflict and civilians became targets, changed the nature of warfare forever. The technologies of mass destruction, the machine gun, the artillery shell, the poison gas, the submarine, and the aircraft, would be refined and expanded in the decades to come. The next war would be even more terrible, with civilian deaths far exceeding military ones, and with weapons capable of destroying entire cities in an instant. Looking back on the First World War, it is hard to escape a sense of tragic waste, of millions of lives sacrificed for causes that seem in retrospect both obscure and insufficient. The war began with a single assassination, escalated through a series of miscalculations and failures of diplomacy, and continued for 4 years because neither side could find a way to stop it without admitting defeat. The soldiers who fought and died believed they were fighting for their countries, for honor, for civilization itself. But the civilization they were defending was transformed beyond recognition by the experience of the war. Yet the war also produced moments of extraordinary courage, compassion, and humanity. Soldiers shared their rations with prisoners, risked their lives to rescue wounded enemies, and maintained their humanity in the most inhuman circumstances. The Christmas truce of 1914 showed that even in the midst of war, men could recognize each other's common humanity. The poets and artists who served in the war created works of lasting power, bearing witness to the horror and the pity of it all. Their voices still speak to us across the century, reminding us of what war really means and what it costs. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, the conflict so terrible that humanity would never fight again. That hope was disappointed within a generation, as the seeds planted by the war grew into an even more destructive conflict. But perhaps we can still learn from the experience of those who lived through it, who saw the best and worst of humanity in those 4 years of fire and blood. Perhaps we can still honor their sacrifice by working for a world in which such slaughter will never be necessary again. The war began with one bullet fired by a teenage assassin on a street corner in Sarajevo. It ended with 20 million dead, empires destroyed, and a world transformed forever. In between was an experience of suffering and destruction that shaped everything that came after. The First World War was the great catastrophe of the 20th century, the event that made all the other catastrophes possible. Understanding it is essential to understanding the world we live in today. Let me now take you deeper into some of the aspects of this war that deserve more attention, starting with the experience of the common soldier, the man who actually did the fighting and dying. The armies that marched to war in 1914 were made up primarily of young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who had been raised in a world of nationalism, militarism, and romantic notions of heroic warfare. They expected the war to be an adventure, a chance to prove their manhood and serve their countries. They expected it to be over quickly, with decisive battles and clear victories. What they got was something very different. The first thing that struck the soldiers was the scale of the experience, the sheer number of men involved, and the vast distances covered. Mobilization brought together millions of men from every corner of each nation, men who would otherwise never have met, from different classes and regions and walks of life. They were thrown together in the great mixing bowl of the army, subjected to the same training, the same discipline, the same dangers. For many, this was the first time they had traveled far from home, the first time they had seen foreign lands, and the first time they had experienced life outside their small communities. The journey to the front was itself a profound experience. Soldiers travelled by train, packed into cattle cars or uncomfortable passenger coaches, passing through unfamiliar landscapes on their way to an unknown destination. They sang songs and wrote letters home, trying to maintain their spirits. But as they approached the combat zone, the mood changed. They could hear the distant rumble of the guns, see the flashes of artillery on the horizon, smell the distinctive odor of the battlefield, a mixture of cordite, decay, and disturbed earth. Many described a growing sense of unreality, as if they were entering a different world with its own rules and its own logic. The trenches were a universe unto themselves, a subterranean world of mud and darkness where men lived like moles. The typical front-line trench was about 6 to 8 feet deep and 4 feet wide, dug into the earth and reinforced with sandbags and wooden frames. The floor was covered with duckboards to keep men's feet out of the mud, though in wet weather this was often a losing battle. The walls were dotted with firing steps, ledges where soldiers could stand to shoot over the parapet, and dugouts, small caves carved into the trench walls where men could rest and shelter from bombardment. The daily routine of trench life was monotonous and exhausting. The day began before dawn with stand to, when all men took their positions on the firing step in case of an enemy attack, which was most likely to come in the uncertain light of early morning. After stand to came breakfast, usually tea and whatever rations were available, often cold because cooking fires were forbidden in the forward trenches as they could attract enemy artillery. The day was spent in maintenance, repairing the trenches, filling sandbags, improving dugouts, and trying to sleep despite the constant noise of artillery and the threat of sudden death. Night was the busy time in the trenches. Under cover of darkness, working parties went out into no man's land to repair barbed wire, dig new trenches, and bring in the dead and wounded from previous engagements. Patrols crept across the blasted landscape, listening posts were established, and raiding parties struck at the enemy trenches, hoping to capture prisoners for intelligence or simply to demonstrate aggression. These nocturnal activities were extremely dangerous, carried out in darkness with the constant risk of detection and death. The physical conditions of trench life were appalling. The trenches were infested with rats that fed on the bodies of the dead and had no fear of the living. They ran over sleeping soldiers, gnawed at food supplies and spread disease. Lice were equally ubiquitous, infesting every garment and causing constant itching and misery. The men scratched until they bled, and the lice laid their eggs in the seams of their uniforms, hatching new generations faster than they could be killed. Trench fever, spread by lice, caused high fever, severe pain, and debilitation that could last for weeks. The trenches were either too wet or too dry, depending on the season and the geology. In low-lying areas like Flanders, water was a constant enemy, seeping through the walls and flooding the floor. Men stood for days in water up to their knees, developing trench foot, a painful condition in which the flesh became soft and rotten, and could eventually require amputation. In drier areas, dust was the problem, clogging weapons and lungs, combining with the smell of the dead to create an atmosphere that was almost unbreathable. The smell of the trenches was something that no one who experienced it ever forgot. It was a compound of many elements: unwashed bodies, latrine pits, cordite from explosions, the chemical tang of poison gas, and above all, the sweet, sickening smell of death. Bodies could not always be recovered from no man's land, and even when they were brought back, there was often no time or place to bury them properly. Men became accustomed to living alongside the dead, using corpses to reinforce trench walls, or simply ignoring them as they decomposed. Food in the trenches was monotonous and often inadequate. The basic ration was bully beef, a canned corned beef that was edible but boring, accompanied by hard biscuits that were often weevil-infested, and tea, the universal solvent of British Army life. Fresh food was rare, and vegetables almost non-existent. The men supplemented their rations with whatever they could buy or scrounge, and packages from home containing cakes, chocolate, and cigarettes were precious beyond measure. Cigarettes in particular became the currency of the trenches, used to trade for food, favours, and comfort. Despite all this, the men in the trenches developed a remarkable esprit de corps, a sense of comradeship and shared identity that was often stronger than any loyalty to nation or cause. The platoon or company became a family, with its own traditions, its own humour, and its own code of conduct. Men who might never have spoken to each other in civilian life became brothers in arms, sharing dangers, privations, and occasionally joys. This comradeship was one of the few positive things to emerge from the war, and veterans often spoke of it with nostalgia, even as they condemned the war itself. The psychological strain of trench warfare was enormous. Men lived with the constant knowledge that they might be killed at any moment by a shell, a sniper, a gas attack, or a trench raid. The bombardments were particularly terrifying, hours or days of continuous shelling during which men could do nothing but crouch in their dugouts and wait, feeling the earth shake and hoping that the next shell would not find them. The noise was indescribable, a continuous roar that made communication impossible and drove men to the edge of madness. Shell shock, as it was then called, was the psychological wound that the war inflicted on a generation. Soldiers who had been brave and competent suddenly became trembling wrecks, unable to speak, to move or to control their bodies. Some shook uncontrollably, others became catatonic, still others relived the trauma of battle over and over again, unable to escape their memories. The military authorities were initially unsympathetic, viewing shell shock as a form of cowardice or malingering, and some sufferers were shot for desertion or cowardice when they were in fact mentally ill. Gradually, doctors came to understand that shell shock was a genuine medical condition, a response to trauma that affected even the bravest soldiers. The battles themselves were exercises in organized chaos, planned to the smallest detail, but dissolving into confusion as soon as they began. The typical attack started with an artillery bombardment designed to destroy enemy defenses and cut the barbed wire. This bombardment might last hours, days, or even weeks, as at the Somme. Then, at a predetermined moment, whistles blew and the infantry went over the top, climbing out of their trenches and advancing across no man's land toward the enemy. What happened next depended on the success of the bombardment and the quality of the enemy defenses. If the bombardment had done its job, the attackers might find the enemy trenches smashed, the wire cut, and the defenders dead or dazed. They could then occupy the position and prepare to receive the inevitable counterattack. But if the bombardment had failed, if the defenders had survived in their deep dugouts, if the wire was still intact, then the attackers walked into a killing field. Machine guns opened up from multiple directions, artillery shells exploded among the advancing infantry, and men died in windows cut down before they could even reach the enemy wire. The machine gun was the weapon that defined the First World War, the device that made defense so much stronger than attack. A single machine gun, operated by 2 or 3 men, could kill hundreds of attackers in minutes, sweeping back and forth across no man's land with a hail of bullets. The Germans had more machine guns than the Allies at the start of the war, and used them with deadly effect. The Allies learned slowly and expensively that frontal attacks against machine guns were suicidal, but the lesson was not fully absorbed until millions had died. Artillery was the other great killer of the war, responsible for perhaps 60% of all casualties. The guns ranged from small field pieces that could be moved by horses to massive siege guns that required railway mounting and could throw shells weighing over a ton. The high-explosive shell could destroy trenches, bury men alive, and create the cratered moonscape that characterized the battlefields of the Western Front. The shrapnel shell burst in the air, scattering metal balls over a wide area, and was particularly deadly against men in the open. The experience of being under artillery bombardment was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the war. There was nothing to do but wait, nowhere to run, no enemy to fight back against. Men huddled in dugouts and shell holes, praying that the next shell would miss them, listening to the whistle of incoming rounds and trying to judge from the sound whether they were in danger. A direct hit on a dugout could bury its occupants alive, and rescue was often impossible. Men went mad from the strain, and those who survived were often permanently marked by the experience. Gas warfare added a new dimension of horror to the conflict. The first gas attacks used chlorine, a greenish-yellow cloud that drifted across no man's land and caused soldiers to choke and die as the chemical destroyed their lungs. Protection against chlorine was relatively simple. A wet cloth over the mouth and nose could provide some defense, but later gases were more sophisticated. Phosgene was more lethal than chlorine and harder to detect. Mustard gas caused severe blistering of the skin and could blind its victims, and it persisted in the environment for days, making contaminated areas impassable. Gas masks became standard equipment, but they were uncomfortable and reduced combat effectiveness. Wearing a mask in hot weather was exhausting, and the reduced visibility and difficulty breathing made coordinated action almost impossible. The fear of gas was out of proportion to the actual casualties it caused, which were a small fraction of total war losses. But this fear itself was a weapon, keeping soldiers in a constant state of anxiety, and requiring them to carry masks at all times. Tanks were introduced in an attempt to break the deadlock of trench warfare. These armoured vehicles, developed in secrecy by the British, could cross no man's land, crush barbed wire, and provide mobile firepower to support the infantry. The first tanks went into action at the Somme in September 1916, achieving surprise, but with limited tactical success due to their small numbers and mechanical unreliability. The first large-scale tank attack at Cambrai in November 1917 showed what tanks could achieve, breaking through the German lines and advancing several miles. But tanks in the First World War were too slow, too unreliable, and too few in number to be decisive. Their potential would only be fully realized in the Second World War. Aircraft were another new technology that the war accelerated. At the outbreak of war, military aviation was in its infancy, with fragile machines used primarily for reconnaissance, but the war drove rapid development. Fighters engaged in aerial combat, developing tactics and technologies that would be refined in future conflicts. Bombers attacked enemy positions, supply lines, and eventually cities, though the bombs of the First World War were too small to cause significant damage. Aircraft became the eyes of the army, spotting for artillery and photographing enemy positions, and control of the air became a key objective for both sides. The war at sea was fought primarily beneath the waves, as German submarines tried to strangle Britain's maritime trade. The submarine offensive reached its peak in early 1917, when U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. Britain came closer to defeat in this period than at any other time in the war. The introduction of the convoy system, in which merchant ships travelled in groups protected by warships, dramatically reduced losses and saved Britain from starvation. But the submarine had demonstrated its potential as a weapon of economic warfare, a lesson that would be applied again in the next war. The war extended far beyond Europe, involving every continent and transforming the entire world. In Africa, small forces fought for control of Germany's colonies, with campaigns in Togo, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, and most prolonged of all, East Africa, where the German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck conducted a guerrilla campaign that tied down huge Allied forces until the armistice. In the Middle East, British and Australian forces fought the Ottomans in Palestine and Mesopotamia, while T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, organized an Arab revolt against Turkish rule. In Asia, Japan seized German possessions in China and the Pacific, establishing positions that would become the basis for Japanese expansion in later decades. The war also involved peoples who had no voice in the decisions that sent them to fight. Colonial subjects from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean served in the armies of Britain, France, and Germany, fighting in a European war for European causes. Indian troops defended the Suez Canal and fought at Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia. African soldiers served on the Western Front and in the African campaigns. Chinese and Vietnamese laborers were recruited to dig trenches and unload ships behind the lines. These men served with courage and distinction, but they were often treated as inferior by the Europeans they fought alongside, and their service did not bring the political recognition they might have hoped for. The home fronts were as important to the war as the battlefields. Total war required the mobilization of entire societies, with every resource directed toward the war effort. Governments took control of economies, directing labor and materials to essential industries, rationing food and fuel, and suppressing dissent. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men, working in factories, driving ambulances, and serving as nurses close to the front. This experience would contribute to the political emancipation of women in the years after the war. Propaganda became a weapon of war, as governments sought to maintain morale and demonize the enemy. Stories of German atrocities in Belgium, sometimes exaggerated but often based on real events, were used to justify the war and recruit volunteers. The enemy was portrayed as barbaric, inhuman, a threat to civilization itself. This propaganda was effective in maintaining support for the war, but it also made compromise peace more difficult and contributed to the punitive terms imposed on Germany at Versailles. The economic strain of total war was enormous. All the major powers went heavily into debt to finance the conflict, borrowing from their own citizens and from neutral countries, particularly the United States. Britain and France borrowed vast sums from American banks, creating a financial relationship that would have profound consequences for the post-war world. Germany, cut off from international markets by the British blockade, resorted to printing money, setting the stage for the hyperinflation that would devastate the German economy in the early 1920s. The war transformed the relationship between the state and the individual. Governments acquired powers that would have been unthinkable before the war. conscripting men for military service, directing labor, controlling prices and wages, censoring the press, and imprisoning dissenters. These powers were supposed to be temporary, but many of them persisted after the war ended, creating precedents for the expanded state power of the 20th century. Religion provided comfort for many soldiers and their families, but the war also challenged religious faith. How could a loving God allow such slaughter? The chaplains who served at the front struggled to answer this question, and many soldiers lost their faith in the trenches. Others found their faith deepened by the experience, seeing in the suffering of the war a reflection of the suffering of Christ. The war produced religious poetry of great power, most notably the work of Wilfred Owen, who wrote of the pity of war rather than its glory. Literature and art were profoundly influenced by the war. The early war poetry was patriotic and romantic, celebrating the nobility of sacrifice and the justice of the cause. But as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, the tone changed. Poets like Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg wrote of the horror and futility of the conflict, of mud and blood and meaningless death. Their work, much of it published only after the war, shaped the way subsequent generations understood the conflict. The war also influenced visual art, with movements like Dada and Surrealism emerging in part as responses to the absurdity and horror of the conflict. The peace that ended the war was negotiated at Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors, where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871. The symbolism was deliberate, a reversal of German triumph, a humiliation that many Germans would never forget or forgive. The conference was dominated by the Big Four, the leaders of Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, with Germany excluded until the terms were ready to be presented. The German delegation was given 3 weeks to submit written comments on the treaty, but no opportunity for negotiation. They signed under protest, describing the treaty as a diktat, a dictated peace imposed by force. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of significant territory. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Parts of eastern Germany went to the newly reconstituted Poland, including a corridor to the sea that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Saar region was placed under League of Nations administration, with its coal mines given to France. Germany's overseas colonies were confiscated and distributed among the victors as League mandates. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. Germany's military was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The army was limited to 100,000 men with no tanks, no heavy artillery, and no general staff. The navy was reduced to a coastal defense force with no submarines and no capital ships. The air force was abolished entirely. These restrictions were meant to prevent Germany from ever again threatening its neighbors, but they also created a sense of grievance that nationalist politicians would exploit. The most controversial provision of the treaty was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which required Germany to accept responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. This was the legal basis for the demand for reparations, compensation for the damage caused by the war. The amount of reparations was not fixed at Versailles but was left to a commission, which eventually set the figure at 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum that Germany could never realistically pay. The reparations issue would poison international relations for the next decade and contribute to the economic instability that helped bring Hitler to power. The other peace treaties dismembered the empires that had lost the war. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria and the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary completed the breakup of the Habsburg monarchy. Austria was reduced to a small German-speaking state, forbidden to unite with Germany and stripped of its industrial heartland. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory and population, creating millions of Hungarian minorities in the successor states. The bitterness created by these treaties would contribute to the instability of interwar Europe. The Treaty of Sevres with the Ottoman Empire was even more punitive, partitioning Anatolia itself and giving portions to Greece, Italy, and France. But this treaty was never implemented. Mustafa Kemal led a nationalist resistance that defeated the Greeks and forced a renegotiation. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 recognized the independence of the Turkish Republic and restored most of Anatolia to Turkish control. It was the only treaty that a defeated power managed to overturn, a testament to Turkish determination and Allied exhaustion. The peace treaties created new nations across Europe and the Middle East, redrawing the map according to the principle of national self-determination. But this principle was applied inconsistently, and millions of people found themselves as minorities in states dominated by other nationalities. The Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, the Hungarians in Romania, the Ukrainians in Poland, these minority populations were sources of grievance and potential conflict. The peace settlement created as many problems as it solved, and within a generation, Europe would be at war again. The League of Nations was supposed to prevent future wars by providing a forum for the peaceful resolution of disputes. It was Woodrow Wilson's great dream, the international organization that would make war obsolete. But the League was fatally weakened from the start. The United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, keeping America out of the organization that its president had created. Germany was excluded initially and was only admitted in 1926, and the Soviet Union was not admitted until 1934. Without the great powers committed to its success, the League could not function as intended. The 1920s saw some efforts at international cooperation, including the Locarno Treaties of 1925, which seems to promise a new era of reconciliation between Germany and its former enemies. But the Great Depression that began in 1929 shattered this fragile peace. Economic collapse bred political extremism, and in Germany, the Nazi Party rose to power, promising to overturn the Versailles settlement and restore German greatness. The League of Nations proved unable to stop Japanese aggression in Manchuria, Italian aggression in Ethiopia, or German remilitarization of the Rhineland. By 1939, the post-war order had collapsed, and a new war was beginning. The Second World War was in many ways a continuation of the First, a resumption of the conflict that had been suspended but not resolved in 1918. Many of the same nations fought, on largely the same sides for many of the same reasons. But the Second World War was even more destructive, with perhaps 70 million dead, most of them civilians. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, was the ultimate expression of the racial ideology that had been strengthened by the nationalism of the First World War. The atomic bombs that ended the war in the Pacific introduced a new dimension of destructive power that threatened the very survival of human civilization. The legacy of the First World War extends far beyond its immediate political consequences. The war changed the way people thought about war itself. Before 1914, war was often seen as noble, romantic, even beneficial, a test of national character and a source of social renewal. After the war, this view was much harder to sustain. The poets and novelists who had fought in the trenches wrote of the pity and futility of war, and their work shaped public consciousness for generations. Pacifism became a powerful movement in the interwar years, and the memory of the trenches made European nations reluctant to confront aggression in the 1930s. The war also changed the relationship between individuals and the state. The mass mobilizations, the conscription, the economic controls, the propaganda, all represented a new level of state power over citizens' lives. This expansion of state power continued after the war, as governments took on responsibilities for social welfare, economic management, and public health that would have been unimaginable before 1914. The welfare state, in its modern form, is in many ways a product of the First World War. The experience of the war created a generation that was marked forever by what it had witnessed and endured. The veterans returned home changed men, often unable to readjust to civilian life, haunted by memories that would not fade. Many became cynical about the values of the society that had sent them to fight, distrustful of authority and skeptical of patriotic rhetoric. This disillusionment contributed to the cultural ferment of the 1920s, the rejection of Victorian morality, and the questioning of traditional beliefs and institutions. The war accelerated changes that were already underway in technology, society, and culture. The internal combustion engine, the airplane, the radio, all were developed or refined during the war and transformed civilian life afterward. Medical advances made during the war, including blood transfusion, reconstructive surgery, and the treatment of psychological trauma, saved lives for decades to come. The social changes prompted by the war, including the entry of women into new occupations and the extension of political rights, transformed the nature of citizenship in the 20th century. For historians, the First World War remains a subject of endless fascination and debate. Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Who was responsible? How should we remember the millions who died? These questions have no easy answers, and historians continue to argue about them more than a century later. Some emphasize the role of impersonal forces, the alliance systems, the arms races, the mobilization plans that seemed to make war inevitable. Others focus on the decisions of individuals, the Kaiser's blank check, Berchtold's ultimatum, Gray's hesitation, that might have changed the outcome. Still others see the war as the product of deeper social and cultural forces, nationalism, imperialism, militarism, that had been building for decades. What we can say with certainty is that the First World War was a turning point in human history, a moment when the old order collapsed and a new world began to emerge. The empires that had dominated the 19th century, the Austrian, the Ottoman, the Russian, the German, all fell or were transformed. New nations emerged, some successful, others doomed to failure. New ideologies, communism and fascism, arose from the ruins of the old order and would compete for dominance in the decades to come. New technologies of destruction were developed that would make the next war even more terrible. And millions of ordinary people lived through an experience that changed them forever, that taught them the true cost of war and the fragility of the civilization they had taken for granted. The soldiers who fought in the First World War are now all gone, the last verified veteran having died in 2012. But their memory lives on in the cemeteries and memorials that dot the landscape of France and Belgium, in the literature and art that the war inspired, and in the histories that continue to be written. The 11th of November is still observed as Armistice Day or Remembrance Day in many countries, a moment to honor those who died and to reflect on the meaning of their sacrifice. The poppies that grow in Flanders fields, where so many soldiers lie buried, have become a symbol of remembrance inspired by the poem written by a Canadian doctor, John McCrae, who served at Ypres and died before the war ended. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, he wrote, and his words have outlived the war they commemorate. The poppies remind us that even in the midst of death, life continues, that the natural world endures despite our attempts to destroy it, and that we have a duty to remember those who died, lest we forget what war truly means. The story of the First World War is ultimately a human story, the story of millions of individuals who loved and feared and hoped and suffered. Behind every statistic is a person, a young man who left his home and family to fight in a war he barely understood, who endured hardships we can scarcely imagine, and who either died in the mud of the trenches or returned home forever changed. These were ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, and their experiences deserve to be remembered and honored. As we look back on the First World War from a distance of more than a century, we can see both how different that world was from our own and how much it shaped the world we live in today. The political boundaries of Europe and the Middle East were largely drawn by the treaties that ended the war. The international institutions that govern our world, however imperfectly, are the successors of the League of Nations. The cultural attitudes that shape our understanding of war and peace, heroism and futility, patriotism and internationalism were all profoundly influenced by the experience of 1914 to 1918. The war teaches us, if we are willing to learn, about the dangers of nationalism, militarism, and the failure of diplomacy. It teaches us about the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, for both destruction and resilience. It teaches us that wars, once started, take on a momentum of their own, that they rarely end quickly or cheaply, and that their consequences extend far beyond what anyone could have predicted. These are lessons that remain relevant today, as we face our own challenges of international conflict and cooperation. The First World War was not the war to end all wars, as some hoped it would be, but perhaps it can still serve as a warning, a reminder of what happens when nations allow their disputes to escalate beyond the point of no return, when they put their faith in military solutions to political problems, and when they forget that the young men they send to fight are human beings with lives and families and hopes for the future. Perhaps by remembering the catastrophe of 1914 to 1918, we can work to ensure that nothing like it ever happens again. And so we come to the end of our story, the story of how one bullet led to 20 million dead, how a teenage assassin on a street corner in Sarajevo set in motion a chain of events that would transform the world. It is a story of tragedy and heroism, of folly and courage, of humanity at its worst and sometimes at its best. It is a story that belongs to all of us, for we are all living in the world that the First World War created. May we remember it, may we learn from it, and may we honor those who lived and died through those terrible years.